My topic this morning is Jerusalem Gentiles in the last days. This is not a joke now, folks. It reminds me of the pastor who, he said, now before I give my sermon, I want to say something important. And then in the middle of it, he said, now I would like to pause and quote someone who knows what he's talking about. But anyway, this is not a joke. Today in Philadelphia, if you went there and visited, you would find there is a place of business, and on the marquee it says, we would rather have 1,000 terrorists as customers than one Jew. Now I hear you people gasping. It happens to be Bernstein's funeral parlor. And I only mention that to illustrate the fact that we need to know the facts, all the facts, before we come to any conclusions. And I want to give you some facts this morning. I get angry. Oh, my wife says, don't say that. But I do get angry. I don't know if you saw it. This is the Globe and Mail yesterday morning. Big picture of Bill Graham. And I was half asleep because I got in at 2 o'clock yesterday morning, the other morning, and my wife, I thought it was Billy Graham. No, it's Bill Graham. But Bill Graham praised, here he is with Arafat, just a big smile and warmth of his handshake, praised Yasser Arafat yesterday for vowing to curb suicide bombings and hold elections, but condemned Palestinian terrorism. I'm sorry, folks. That's like praising a mass murderer who says, oh, I'm not going to kill anybody anymore. Isn't that great? Well, then we wouldn't put him in prison, would we? Arafat is the worst. He holds all the records. 4 airplanes at once, they already did that. 40 aircraft they blew up. The largest number of hostages ever taken, 300. The biggest ransom ever paid, $5 million by Lufthansa. The widest variety of targets, everything from the Achille Lauro, you remember the passenger ship where they shoved the guy over in the Mediterranean, to 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympics. And the PLO is invited to bring their athletes to the Olympics. Isn't that wonderful? What they did well, they had 55 bases in Jordan. They were so evil that King Hussein turned his Bedouin troops on them, and Israel joined with them to chase them out into Lebanon. When Israel finally had to go into Lebanon to chase them out of there, they left about 100,000 young women pregnant. They killed several 100,000 people, nominal Christians. They would pull people off of the streets, strap them to a hospital bed, and command the nurses to drain every drop of blood and stack the dead bodies like cordwood in the hall. I could go on and on. No wonder Ariel Sharon said he wished he had killed Arafat when he had him there, and it was the United States, I'm sorry, that forbade him to do it and said, let them go. And then Arafat swore off of terrorism, wrote a letter, and that was why Oslo happened, because he said, oh, we'll be the good guys. Now, 1986, 47 U.S. senators signed a petition, demanded of the State Department, get this man arrested and put away as a mass murderer. One of them was Al Gore. When he was in the White House, he warmly received Arafat, who now has the Nobel Peace Prize. What a world we live in. Well, I want to give you some suppressed and forgotten facts this morning before we look into the Scriptures. And we will look into the Scriptures. Arno last night pointed our attention to, and I won't try to fumble around and find it, but I noticed in my Bible, this is a Bible someone gave me, this is a Schofield Reference Bible, King James, and there in the back, indeed, it does have a map, and it says, a map of Palestine in the days of Jesus. Palestine did not exist in the days of Jesus. That was not until 130 A.D. when the Romans rebuilt Jerusalem as a pagan city. They put a temple to Jupiter on Temple Mount. The Jews, as you can imagine, were a bit upset, and they had an uprising. 500,000 of them were killed, thousands sold into slavery, and in anger, the Romans renamed Israel Syria Palestina after the Philistines, the chief enemies of Israel. From then on, everybody living there was known as Palestinians. Who lived there? Jews. World War II, the British had a volunteer brigade, the Palestinian Brigade. It was all Jews. The Arabs were fighting on Hitler's side. There was a Palestinian Post. It was a Jewish newspaper. There was the Palestinian Symphony Orchestra. It was a Jewish orchestra. It was not until the 50s, really in the 60s, that these people who fled, by the way, they fled because the Arab High Command warned them over the radio, get out, we are coming in, we're going to kill every Jew, you will get in our way, you could be killed too. Get out and then you can come back in when we've exterminated them. Those who did not leave comprise 16% of the voting citizens of Israel today. These are Arabs. You know, they have so-called Palestinians as members of the Knesset. They have voting rights, citizenship rights. No Jew is allowed in Saudi Arabia today even to set foot there. A Jew could not possibly be a citizen of Jordan today. Okay, there's a big difference. This is the only democracy in the Middle East. I want to give you just a few facts that are suppressed. You don't get them from the media and so forth. We hear a lot today about the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. Remember? Just turn the borders back to 1967. Is that what you're hearing? Just turn the borders back to 1967, and then we'll have peace. Israel has been forced by the world to shake hands and negotiate with this mass murderer who has sworn to exterminate them. Well, move the borders back to 1967. The PLO was formed in 1964. What were they going to liberate in 1964? Let's go back to 1948. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, the UN petitioned what was called Palestine. In fact, let's go back a little farther. Let's go back to the 1920s and 30s. The whole world recognized that what was called Palestine belonged to the Jews, and it should be reconstituted as a Jewish homeland. The League of Nations recognized this. All the world powers recognized this. You remember after World War II, after World War I as well, but after World War II, again, the Western powers are carving up the Middle East. They created Saudi Arabia. They created Syria. They created Iraq. They created Jordan. And they were supposed to create a Jewish state as well. And all of Palestine, that included the east side of the Jordan River, they recognized belonged to the Jews. You know the Balfour Declaration. You know that Britain had the mandate to administer this territory until the Jewish homeland, until the Jewish state had been established. Instead, they betrayed the Jews. They kept bringing in more Arabs. They limited the number of Jews. You know that Holocaust survivors within sight of the Holy Land are driven back by the British Navy. Maybe you didn't know that during World War II, Himmler and Hitler offered to sell 500,000 Hungarian Jews to the Allies for $2 apiece. England said there's no room in Palestine for them, and they went to the ovens. You can count the demise of the British Empire upon which the sun never set. Britannia ruled the waves. You can count its demise from when they turned against the Jews. God said, I will curse those who curse you. This is the world that we live in. So move it back to 1967. What about 1948? when the UN partitioned Palestine, and now they gave the Jews 18% of what had originally been designated for them. 82% went to the Arabs. Immediately, Israel, when it declared its independence, May 14, 1948, was attacked by the regular armies of 6 Arab nations to exterminate them. They didn't want them to have anything. So this talk about move the borders back to 67, give us a little more land, is an absolute fraud. Let me just quote the Arab League. This is May 15th, 1948. Quote, "The Arabs intend to conduct a war of extermination and momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and crusades." Well, I hope you know the Crusaders killed every Jew. Some people think they went there to free the Holy Land for the Jews. No, they went there to kill the Jews along with the Turks. And when they took Jerusalem, this is the first crusade under Pope Urban II, who said, go and take that land for yourselves, because this was replacement theology, which we have today. And that comes from the Catholic Church. The Church is the new people of God. The Jews are finished, and go there and take that land for yourselves. Not only did they kill all the Turks, they chased the Jews into the synagogue and set it ablaze. We give you this information, some of our videos, A Woman Rides the Beast, as well as the latest one, Israel, Islam, and Armageddon. Let me quote them again. "It will be a massacre like the Mongolian massacre and the Crusades." Well, the Crusaders killed every Jew, and that's exactly what they intended to do. No Arab map today, anywhere in the world, has Israel on it. They do not acknowledge even the existence of Israel. Let me quote Boutros Ghali. He was at that time the Secretary General of the United Nations. He said, quote, "The Jews must give up their status as a nation and Israel as a state and assimilate as a community in the Arab world." Now, there's an awful lot of hypocrisy connected with September 11th. And again, it does upset me a bit. In the Sudan, and we have another video, Sudan, the Hidden Holocaust. You really need to see some of these things. In the Sudan, the Muslims from the north have killed about 2 million non-Muslims in the south. They cut women's breasts off so they can't nurse their babies. They torture them. They enslave them. There is an active slave market today. Gaddafi buys them for $15 a piece, a slave market throughout the Muslim world. It's horrible what these people are doing. Did you hear anything about it? In Nigeria today, they're killing Christians by the hundreds, by the thousands. They've burned down hundreds of Christian churches. In Indonesia today, they are killing Christians. These are Muslims. They put a machete at their neck, and you will either confess there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet, or off with your head. Today it is happening. Did you ever hear about it? Very few people, thank you. Very few people have heard about it. Very few. But the Twin Towers went down. And then, wow, we're going after these terrorists everywhere, but we wouldn't acknowledge they were Muslims, although all 19 were Muslims. 15 of the 19 from Saudi Arabia. Oh, no, Islam is a peaceful religion. But we're going after the terrorists now, and we can pursue them to Afghanistan, and I think we should. But if Israel pursues them next door, oh, wait, you're overreacting. Can't you make peace with these people? Can't you give them a little more land? Well, in 1967, let's go back to 1967. I want to just give you a few quotes. By the way, our family was there, my wife and I, and our 4 children at that time, ages 8 to 15. We were in Egypt, the end of May 1967. I can tell you we had some adventures. It was a frightening experience. We were the only, well, there was one, a Swiss car. We had the USA on the back of our car, our VW bus, and we had some adventures. And these people were talking about the 19-year war. I have a degree in mathematics. I could not, what 19-year war? I've heard of the 33 Years' War. I've heard of the 100 Years' War. 19-year war. What's this 19-year war? And we finally realized. 1948 to 1967, 19 years. There had never been peace. They had been planning the destruction of Israel this whole time. And they made it very clear to us. I sat, we put our VW bus on a freighter going from Alexandria to Beirut, which was the jewel of the Mediterranean in those days, comparable to any European city. And I sat in the lounge in the evening with these pretty wild, cheering Egyptians and Arabs around me as Nasser reviewed his troops. We will smash them. In fact, we were in Cairo when Nasser returned from Moscow. He had just received the Soviet Peace Prize. And he stepped off the airplane. The reporters rushed up and said, "What will it be?" "War. We'll smash them. We'll drive them into the Mediterranean. We will exterminate them." In fact, we show you in our video, you will see Nasser, and if you could speak Arabic, you would know that is exactly what he is saying. In 1948, we won't give them anything. They can't have anything. Well, let me just give you a few quotes. This is 1964. To the National Assembly of Egypt, Nasser denounced the very existence of Israel. March 8, 1965, he boasted, quote, "We shall enter Palestine with its soil saturated in blood. We aim at the eradication of Israel." I think you need to know some. I could give you hundreds of quotes like this. You know, Anwar Sadat was one of the good guys, wasn't he? Well, I think I mentioned yesterday when Hitler died, Anwar Sadat wrote an open letter to him. We have a copy of this, in which he said, "I hope you're still alive. You were right. We're going to finish the job." On May 16th, 1967, Nasser ordered UN peacekeeping forces to leave the Sinai. By May 18th, Egyptian troops were massed in the Sinai on Israel's border. Syrian troops had done the same on the Golan. I'm quoting from the Berean Call, May 2002. We try to keep you up to date on some of these things and give you some of the facts. The Voice of the Arabs broadcast boasted, quote, "The sole method we shall apply against Israel is total war, which will result in the extermination of Zionist existence." On May 20th, the Syrian defense minister, that was Hafez Assad at that time, now dead, said, quote, "Our forces are now entirely ready to explode the Zionist presence in the Arab homeland, to enter into a battle of annihilation." On May 22nd, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to all Israeli shipping, cutting off their lifeline. That's an act of war. May 27th, Nasser threatened, quote, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel." May 30th, he announced, quote, "The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon are poised on the borders of Israel, while standing behind us are the armies of Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, Sudan, and the whole Arab nation." Iraq's president thundered, "This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map." And I've already told you, there is no Arab map in the world that even shows Israel's existence. You get the picture? This is a little nation. They are ringed by enemies that outnumber them about 40 to 1, backed by Arab oil billions, Soviet advisors, and so forth. Military equipment in 1948, they couldn't even buy. I think it was Arno or one of the speakers that said it was only Czechoslovakia. Israel couldn't get, these Israeli settlers couldn't get arms. Nobody. U.S. wouldn't sell it to them. Britain wouldn't sell it to them. France wouldn't sell it to them. They managed to get some from Czechoslovakia, which needed some money. Here they are, ringed by enemies that have sworn to exterminate them. They talk about the ignominy of 1948. Now you understand why the revival of fundamentalist Islam in the world. Because their imams said, you're losing each war because you're not faithful to Allah and to the Quran. We've got to get back to the fundamentals, and then you will have the blessing of Allah, and He will help you exterminate this enemy. Well, I watched Shimon Peres. You know, the Israelis are brilliant. And I sit there frustrated. Why don't you say something? Why don't you give the facts? They talk about these refugees, Palestinian refugees. Wait a minute. There were twice as many Jews who fled from Arab nations, where for 1,300 years since the advent of Islam, they had been mistreated, abused, killed. 6,000 killed in Fez, Morocco, in one massacre. Down through the years, they've been tortured and beaten and abused and brutalized. And when Israel declared its independence as a nation, they had a place to which they could flee. They fled. Over 800,000 of them. You ever hear any talk about these refugees? Why don't they have the right to return to those nations? I can tell you they wouldn't want to return. And I watched Shimon Peres. This was the 11th of May, 2 weeks ago. He was being interviewed on CNN. He said, definitely there must be and will be a Palestinian state. He spoke of negotiations to establish it and to establish peace with these people. He never once mentioned the vows of the Palestinians and the Arab nations to exterminate them. He never once said, we have offered a state to them if they will only acknowledge our right to exist, which they will not. Anti-Semitism. I don't understand it. There's a kind of blindness out there that besets the whole world. I don't know if you've seen the video, Jihad in America. You ought to get it, done by PBS. And they'll take you right, they took you right, this was back in the 80s, took you right into the cells, terrorist cells connected with the mosques in America. And you will hear the imams who are recruiting jihad warriors for the United States destruction. And you will hear the translation of the Arabic. They're saying heads must be severed, arms must be severed, blood must flow. There must be widows and orphans for the furtherance of Allah's religion in America. Okay? And if you went to the Middle East, you would see graffiti everywhere. It says, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. Okay? Because Muhammad said, Allah has commanded me to fight against all people until all people confess there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. There are a couple of videos put out in French, but they have English subtitles. And one of them is called Israel and the War of Images, the other the Trojan Horse. You will see comments made by Arafat and his men after Oslo. They are pledging to exterminate Israel. There it is. They're going to exterminate the Jews. They're saying all this Oslo, it's all of it is about, we consider it no more than the agreement, the peace agreement, the 10-year peace treaty, which our great prophet Muhammad made with the Quraysh tribe. In 628 AD, Muhammad made a 10-year peace treaty with the Quraysh tribe of Mecca because he didn't have the troops to attack. 2 years later, when he had the troops, he broke the treaty, he attacked them, killed them, took over Mecca, and Arafat says, that's exactly what we're doing. We're modeling this after our great prophet Muhammad. Peace for us means the destruction of Israel. Here's just a quote from, you'll see this on the video, from one of the, that's a Friday sermon broadcast on Palestinian television by one of Arafat's clerics. he says, quote, Jews are Jews, and he is shouting with great anger. They must be massacred. They must be killed. Allah the Almighty said, fight them. Have no pity for them wherever they are, in whatever country, wherever you meet them, kill them. Okay, it's a nice Friday sermon in a mosque. I think you need to know some of these things. That's why I'm trying to give you a few facts this morning, okay, with which you can better understand what is happening over there in the Middle East. Okay, now our topic is supposed to be Jerusalem, Gentiles, in the last days. Jerusalem is at the heart of this. Jerusalem, who could have imagined it? 2,500 years ago when it lay in ruins. Zechariah prophesied, chapter 12. We have a book titled A Cup of Trembling. That's where I get the title from. He said, God said, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup of trembling. It will be a burdensome stone around the necks of all the nations of the world. Did it come true? We could just take the prophecies concerning Jerusalem, and that would be sufficient to prove that God exists, that the Bible is his word. The prophecies concerning Jerusalem are amazing. But wait, how did this come about? Well, I've been giving you this background so you would understand. Jerusalem is a cup of trembling today, a burdensome stone around the necks of the nations, for one major reason, because of the existence of Islam. It's the Muslims. I'm not talking about Arabs now. I'm talking about Islam. It's Islam that is determined to destroy these people. Why? Some of the, at least one of the speakers has already mentioned it. Turn to Genesis 17. It's because the Arabs claim to be descended from Ishmael. Well, let's give them that. They can't really prove that. There certainly is a lot of Ishmael blood in them, but they also are a mixed race. But notice in Genesis 17, God says to Abram, verse 15, God said unto Abraham, as for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be, and I will bless her, give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Ed Heinsohn talked about this. I don't think he read these verses, but referred to them. Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, Sarah 90, and so forth. And now Abraham says to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. Abraham says, you gave me a son. Ishmael, he's a nice boy. I really like Ishmael. Now, why can't he be the promised son? Why can't he be the one through whom these promises will flow and your covenant will be with him? Abraham asked that question. And God says, Sarah, verse 19, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. As for Ishmael, Ed talked about this, I've heard thee. Behold, I blessed him, make him a great nation, and so forth. Verse 21, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. And we mentioned that 12 times God calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Never, he's called the God of Israel several hundred times. Never is he called the God of Ishmael, not once. The Bible makes it abundantly clear. Now, how do the Muslims get around that? Oh, well, they say, you know, because at the beginning, in the early chapters of the Quran, Muhammad was originally trying to cater to and convert to his new religion Jews and Christians. He called them the people of the book. And the Quran says that God inspired Moses to write the Torah and so forth. Well, then how do you explain this? Because later he contradicts the Bible and he condemns these people to death. Well, the Muslim says, well, the Bible got messed up from the time that we have these original revelations in the Quran. Well, that's absurd. We have manuscripts of the Bible hundreds of years before Muhammad ever came along. And they're the same as the manuscripts after Muhammad came. The Bible was not changed at all. Muhammad changed his mind. Actually, Satan changed his mind for him. And you know, Satan has as much trouble with his guys as God has with his, and I don't know how much of what Satan wants Muhammad to do he does, but he's done a pretty good job of getting most of the message from him. So this is the Islamic religion then that says Ishmael was the son of promise. It wasn't Isaac who was offered on the altar. It was Ishmael who was offered on the altar. That land belongs to us. Don't you understand now why let me quote a Hamas leader. Listen to him. He says, from our ideological point of view, it is not allowed to recognize that Israel controls 1 square meter of historic Palestine. You understand? Because Allah promised that to us. And the very presence of Israel indicates that Allah is not God. The Quran is not the true revelation. Muhammad was a false prophet. We've got to remove the Jews. We've got to establish ourselves in this land. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses. And indeed it will. God is behind these people. You go on a little later in Zechariah chapter 12, he says, you couldn't have believed it. He says, I will make the princes of Judah like fire. They will devour the nations around them. 1973 Yom Kippur War, the closest Israel ever came to being wiped out. Thousands of tanks come pouring across the Sinai, down the Golan. They're all on the highest holiday, Yom Kippur. Nobody's in uniform. No troops out there ready. There's one tank. We stood on the Golan a year ago with an ex-Israeli lieutenant colonel pointing down to his village where he said, his kibbutz actually, where he grew up. He said we had to live underground. They're just shooting at us, rocketing us. You can't go out and plow the fields and so forth. You've got to do something about this Golan. We've got to shove them back. And he said in 1973, here they come. There's one Israeli tank to oppose them. And suddenly they stopped. Nobody can explain it. They stopped. They could have cut right through Israel. There was no opposition. They stopped and gave the Israelis time to mobilize their men. And when that war ended, the Israeli tank columns were on the outskirts of Damascus and Cairo and could have taken it. I will make them like fire to devour the nations around them. They were called back for political reasons. And what do you know? 61 nations broke diplomatic relations with Israel for defending itself. And no one condemned the Arabs for their sneak attack, their determination to exterminate these people. This is the world we live in today. Well, let me quickly, we don't have much time. Let's quickly call your attention to some prophecies about Jerusalem. You remember in Jeremiah 25, I think it's verse 22, somewhere around there. I never memorized the Bible. I just kind of halfway remember it. But God, through Jeremiah, promised 70 years desolation on Jerusalem. You remember that? It was a definite period of time. At the end of that time, he brought his people back. Cyrus allowed them to go back, rebuild the temple, and so forth. Then if you turn to Hosea 3:4, we don't have time, but you can look it up in your leisure. There God says, my people will be without a temple. They'll be without a prince. They're going to be obviously then without a sacrificial system for many, many, many years. This is not 70 years now. This is many years. How many years? Luke 21:24, Jesus tells you how many. He says, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I could give you the facts from way back there. I mean, Jerusalem has been fought over by every major power. First the Babylonians held it, then the Medes and Persians. Alexander the Great took Palestine for the Greeks in 333 BC. Later the Egyptians and Syrians alternately had it until the Romans under Pompey captured Israel in 64 BC. They held it into the 4th century AD. In the 7th century, Islamic invaders took control to be replaced by the Crusaders. Near the end of the 11th century, they held Jerusalem until Saladin retook the city in 1187. Later, the Islamic Mamelukes of Egypt possessed Jerusalem. Then the Ottoman Turkish Empire ruled it for about 400 years. The Turks were on the wrong side. They sided with Germany in World War I. And in 1917, we had the British mandate to administer the region and so forth. Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, let me just mention who's behind this. Theodore Herzl, 1904, in his diary, he tells how he asked Pope Pius X for help. Our people are scattered everywhere. They're hated and persecuted. We need a national homeland. Would you help us? Let me tell you what the Pope said. He records in his diary. We cannot prevent the Jews from returning to Palestine. We could never condone it. In 1919, Pietro Gasparri, he's Secretary of State of the Vatican, he said, the thing that frightens us the most is the thought of the Jews returning to Palestine. We have Pope Pius XII. Oh, yes. He never spoke out against the Holocaust, did he? Oh, yes, but he worked behind the scenes, you understand. Really? Well, show us. We've searched the Nazi archives, and we can't find the evidence. Well, it's in the Vatican archives. Well, let's see it. Well, you understand the Vatican archives are closed. But we do have a letter, Freedom of Information Act in the United States, and we have a copy of a letter that he wrote June 22nd, 1943 to President Roosevelt. He knew how to speak out very forcefully for what he wanted. And in that letter he said there is no precedent in history that a people cast out of their land for 1900 years should ever be allowed back in. If a national homeland is desirable for the Jewish people, someplace other than Palestine would be preferable. You let them in there, it will cause great problems for the world. So we have Pope after Pope. We have the Vatican Secretary of State. We have the Vatican going on record absolutely opposed to hundreds of promises that God has made in his word, that he would bring his ancient people back, where the Messiah would then rule over them. Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I remember, I've been at a lot of prophecy conferences, as some of you can probably remember. If you go back to 1967, when the Israelis took East Jerusalem, that was when they took it. That's when they took East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Egypt and Jordan had had them for 19 years, remember? No talk of a Palestinian state. They'd been used for terrorism, and finally Israel had enough. They're ringed by all these enemies who are going to exterminate them. You remember Israel made a preemptive strike, and they destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. That was called the Six-Day War. That was the war that they had prepared for 19 years to exterminate the Jews, and God's promises were fulfilled. That was used for terrorism. It was a launching pad against Israel. Israel took those places at that time. That's when it happened back there. That's why it happened. And then they took Temple Mount. Remember, they took East Jerusalem. And I can remember the prophecy experts saying, that's the times the Gentiles are now fulfilled. They got Jerusalem. And you remember General Moshe Dayan, with a patch over his eye, he immediately turned it over to King Hussein of Jordan. 1994, the PLO took possession. Today, the PLO Waqf is up on Temple Mount, destroying every vestige of any evidence that Jews were ever there. Arafat says this was never a Jewish city. It's been our city for thousands of years. It belongs to us. The Jews were never here. They're doing their best to destroy every bit of evidence. And you, if you go as a tourist today, you can't get up on Temple Mount. Someone else is in control. 1947, when the UN petitioned Palestine, UN Resolution 181, they said, Jerusalem must never be under the possession of the Jews. It must remain an international city forever. 1998, the Vatican's foreign minister called the Israeli presence in East Jerusalem, quote, illegal occupation. March 1999, Israel was notified again that the European Union, quote, does not recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. You know that the Knesset is in Jerusalem. The embassies of the world are somewhere else. They will. Is there a nation in the world that the other nations will not allow them to name their own capital? How would you like it if they did that to Canada? How would we like it in America if they said, you can't have Washington, D.C.? That belongs to the world. That's the situation, and it's in fulfillment of what Jesus said. Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. In a papal bull, the year 2000 Jubilee, Pope John Paul II once again rejected Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. In mid-February 2000, remember when he visited there, the Vatican signed an agreement with the PLO calling for international guarantees to preserve the proper identity and sacred character of Jerusalem under international control, and on it goes. Jesus said, amazing prophecy, Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. When will that be? Well, we may have differences of opinion. I don't know. But I can tell you when I believe it will be. It will not be until Armageddon. The last fling of the Gentile nations will be their attack to wipe out the Jews. You think we're going to continue to support this tiny nation? It's a plague. It's a problem. We're just offending the Arabs with their oil wealth. Why should we support these people any longer? Give me a good reason. Let's get them, let them be wiped out. Hitler was right. Be done with this. Then we'll have peace in the world. It's coming to that. It's coming to that. You can see it coming. It's coming to that under Antichrist. That is the last claim of the Gentile nations as they come to wipe out the Jews. And God intervenes. We mentioned already. They're going to be judged. The nations of the world will be judged for what they did. That's part of Armageddon. And the Israelis, the Jews, are going to be judged for how they've rejected their Messiah, and they're going to be brought to such a difficult, impossible situation that they will cry out. And then the prophecy of Jesus will be fulfilled. You will not see me until you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Well, that reminds us of another verse people have problems with. Matthew 24:33. Remember it says, Jesus said, all these things, this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. We have Reconstructionists out there. Somebody was asking me about them. These are the Calvinists. These are what they call Reformed theologians. I'm sorry, I don't want to offend any of you Calvinists, but I get a little upset when they call this Reformation theology, the great Reformation creeds. Wait a minute. John Calvin was 8 years old when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle Chapel. There was a lot of other things involved in the Reformation besides Calvinism, and they've hijacked the Reformation and taken it over. And now they have the gall to call Calvinism Reformed theology. Okay? And part of that Reformed theology is the teaching. It was all happened back there in AD 70. Nero was the Antichrist. Christ did return. He promised he would return. He returned in the person of the Roman armies to wipe out the Jews, to exterminate them. They're finished. This is replacement theology. It's growing in popularity in the church today. Jesus said, this generation shall not pass till all things are fulfilled. All of these things, these prophecies. Well, you see, that meant the generation of that day, didn't it? Didn't that mean within 40 years from them, and that was AD 70, it would all be fulfilled? And so it was all fulfilled in AD 70? I never believed that. Then there's another interpretation. Well, what it means is the generation that sees Israel back in its land, and they won't pass until all of this is fulfilled. No, I never believed that one either. There's another interpretation that is biblical. Jesus talked about a rebellious generation, a disobedient, sign-seeking, gainsaying, Christ-rejecting, God-resisting, unbelieving generation. And I believe he meant that generation will not pass until everything is fulfilled. And I've quoted you from Zechariah 12:10. That indeed is when Their eyes at last are opened. Everything has been fulfilled. Christ said, when you see all these things fulfilled, then you know I am right at the door. The second coming, not the rapture. The rapture is verse 44 in Matthew 24. At such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man cometh. But the second coming, any idiot knows he's coming. Revelation 19 says even the Antichrist knows and goes out with his armies to do battle with him. That generation of unbelief, yes, many Jews are coming to Christ today. Praise God. Pray for them that this trouble in Israel will cause many of them to turn to the Lord. But the nation as a whole, no, that generation will not pass until all is fulfilled. When all is fulfilled and they cry out for me, I will return, Christ says. Then they will look upon me whom they have pierced. And that unbelieving generation will pass away. All Israel shall be saved. When it says, he that endures to the end shall be saved, it's not talking about hanging on to Jesus and hanging on to your salvation lest you lose it. But those who are alive at the second coming, there'll only be 1/3 of the Jews on this earth. They will all see him. And they will all believe. And they will all be redeemed, transformed. I'll give you a heart of flesh for your heart of stone, and you will never, ever pollute my holy name again. Well, let's pray for that day. But before that happens, we're leaving. Praise God. He seems to indicate I've got to, no, I don't have any more time, I don't think. Okay.